Number 10. Shauna Elliott. In an unspeakable tragedy that occurred in August of 2016, a drunk bikini-clad college student named Shauna Elliott plowed her car head-on into the vehicle of an expecting couple in San Marcos, Texas. 23-year-old father-to-be Fabian Guerrero and his unborn child succumbed to their injuries, leaving his wife, Christian Nicole, behind as the lone survivor of the tragically slain young family. In March of 2018, 22-year-old Elliott was convicted of 2 counts of intoxication manslaughter and 1 count of intoxication assault. The judge sentenced her to 7 years in prison for each life she took, amounting to a 14-year term, followed by 10 years of probation. Under the conditions of her sentence, Elliott became eligible for parole in 2023, but she'll continue to serve 2 days in jail every year on the anniversary of the accident until she's finished serving her decade-long probation sentence. The judge also ordered Elliott to perform community service and attend drug and alcohol treatment. Number 9. Brianna Barazzini. 18-year-old Brianna Barazzini stabbed fellow teenager Halia Culbertson in the neck at a convenience store in Columbus, Ohio in March of 2023, amid a long-running feud between the two. The incident began as a verbal argument but quickly escalated into physical violence. Culbertson died from her injuries, and Barazzini was charged with murder. In the first of several perceived injustices to the victim's family, the accused stabber was released on bond while awaiting trial. Then, as the trial approached in June of 2024, Barazzini struck a last-minute agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for her guilty plea to involuntary manslaughter, the state dropped the murder charge against the young woman. The judge overseeing the case said that it was likely in Barazzini's best interest to take a plea deal, considering the incriminating nature of the evidence against her. Following her guilty plea, the state asked the judge to remand her into custody, but he allowed for Barazzini to remain out on bond as she awaits her sentencing hearing. She faces up to 3 years in prison and is due to be sentenced in July of 2024. 3 years may not seem like a long sentence for killing someone, but Barazzini's defense lawyer claimed that his client tried to back out of the fight before she resorted to stabbing the victim. Speaking with the Columbus Dispatch, attorney Robert Crapan said that Culbertson continued charging at Barazzini and striking her in the face, prompting Barazzini to swing at Culbertson with the knife. Of course, there are 2 sides to every story. More than anything, the incident shows just how tragic a dispute between teens can become when things get out of hand. Number 8. Luke Ingram. Early one morning in November of 2022, 50-year-old Clint Ingram awoke to the screams of his father, 85-year-old Darwin Ingram, inside their Palm Coast, Florida home. He found the senior citizen unresponsive and bleeding in a chair. When Clint tried to dial 911, he was attacked by his own son and Darwin's grandson, 19-year-old Luke Ingram. After being placed in a chokehold twice, Clint managed to escape and ran to a neighbor's house for help. Flagler County deputies responded to the scene, where they tased and tackled Luke when he refused to obey their commands. Speaking with Flagler Live following Luke's arrest for his grandfather's murder, Sheriff Rick Staley described how the suspect attacked deputies with Herculean strength. Before being tased, the young man bit 2 deputies and threatened to kill other law enforcement officers. While authorities did not immediately disclose a motive for the deadly assault, court documents offered some possible insight into what led up to the homicide. Luke's family had recently talked him into returning home from his college in Georgia after being told that the teenager was acting strangely. Furthermore, a police report noted that the accused killer had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. In May of 2024, the judge presiding over the case found Luke not guilty by reason of insanity on charges of murder, assault with a weapon, and battery by strangulation. He was also found not guilty on charges of resisting an officer without violence, resisting with violence, and aggravated battery on a law enforcement officer. Under an insanity ruling, a defendant is sent to a state hospital until or unless they are deemed to no longer be a threat to themselves or others. This means that the amount of time Luke will remain in custody is unpredictable. Number 7. Connie DeRose Miller. A South Carolina family's world was shattered in an instant in April of 2024 when a teenager named Donovan Browning was shot dead in a residential neighborhood in Chester in the middle of the night. Responding officers arrived to find another teenager performing CPR on Donovan in the street. The young man died from his injuries at the scene, and 18-year-old Connie DeRose Miller is now facing a murder charge in connection with his death. Donovan's father, Donald Browning, told local station WCNC that the family couldn't fathom why someone would have killed the teen. Donald said he always taught Donovan and his twin brother Dory to be streetwise, but sadly it wasn't enough to save Donovan from having his life taken from him. The victim's older brother, Correll Kennedy, expressed frustration over how easy it is for dangerous people to obtain a gun. The family also stated that they were considering taking their fight for justice to lawmakers to prevent other families from experiencing similar suffering. As of June of 2024, Connie DeRose Miller remains held without bail at the Chester County Detention Center on charges of murder and assault/attempted murder. The outcome of the case remains to be seen. Number 6. Kiana Opal. 18-year-old Kiana Opal of Omaha, Nebraska, had just graduated high school when she was accused of stabbing a fellow teenager named Ezra Sinkiewicz to death in May of 2024. According to law enforcement, police responded to a call about the incident during the early morning hours on a Sunday. Sinkiewicz succumbed to her injuries at a nearby hospital, and Opal was identified as the suspected killer. Witnesses told police that Opal was behaving erratically earlier that evening and that she had threatened people with a taser inside a local residence. A group of friends left the home, including Sinkiewicz, and returned a short while later. They claimed that Opal grabbed a pair of knives, walked straight towards Sinkiewicz, and stabbed her in the chest without saying a word. Opal was taken into custody at the scene on suspicion of murder and remains held without bail as she awaits her next scheduled court hearing in July of 2024. The young woman's neighbor was shocked to learn of her arrest and the horrific nature of the crime, telling local station KETV that Opal was always friendly to her and her pets. According to the most recent available updates on the case, the investigation is ongoing, and authorities have yet to reveal a suspected motive for the deadly stabbing. Number 5. Braden Roop. While responding to multiple reports of shots fired in June of 2024, police officers in Odessa, Texas followed a trail of blood to the home of 65-year-old James Francis Johnson, where they heard yelling coming from inside. Sadly, though, by the time law enforcement arrived, it was too late to save Johnson's life. The cops entered the home and detained 2 teenagers, including 18-year-old Braden Roop, who allegedly admitted to shooting Johnson. Roop told investigators that he lived with Johnson and that he shot the victim during an argument over their living arrangement. Surveillance footage appeared to show the suspect exiting the house, chasing after Johnson and shooting him 4 times. Another gunshot could be heard off camera before Roop dragged Johnson's body inside the home. Both Roop and a teenage female are accused of murder and tampering with a corpse. According to the most recent available updates on the case, Roop is being held in custody with bond set at $225,000. Number 4. Angela Bodden Mitchell. In late January of 2024, a vehicle sped through a restaurant parking lot and residential backyard in Waterbury, Connecticut, striking several objects before it came to a stop. The driver, 38-year-old Keno Williams, had been shot in the head and was rushed to the hospital, clinging to life. In the meantime, investigators charged 18-year-old Angela Bodden Mitchell with attempted murder, attempted robbery, and conspiracy to commit first-degree robbery. At the time, Williams was not expected to survive. He succumbed to his injuries a few days after the shooting, and the charges against Bodden Mitchell were upgraded to murder. The suspected killer was held on a $2.5 million bond as the investigation continued. At the time, police said that they expected to make additional arrests in connection with the case, but updates have not been forthcoming, leaving it unclear whether authorities still believe that more than one suspect was involved in the crime. According to the TikTok account Code 8 Media, Williams was shot after getting into a verbal altercation with his wife's child. But these details have not been confirmed by law enforcement, and no other sources have reported similar claims. This makes it impossible to determine whether the information is true or not. Number 3. Brittany J. Dwyer. When 19-year-old Brittany J. Dwyer discovered that her grandfather had stashed his life savings of $100,000 inside his home in Adelaide, Australia, she was overcome with greed. In August of 2016, she traveled 2,000 miles from her home in Brisbane to visit 81-year-old Robert Whitwell. They spent time looking at old family photos together. Then, when Dwyer went to leave, she stabbed Whitwell in the neck 4 times. She then washed dishes as her grandfather lay dying on the kitchen floor in a pool of his own blood. Authorities soon traced Dwyer to the crime and charged her with Whitwell's murder. They also charged Dwyer's 22-year-old roommate, Bernadette Burns, who was accused of driving Dwyer to Whitwell's home and waiting outside while the murder took place. According to prosecutors, Burns sat in the car and did her makeup while sending Dwyer text messages telling her to toughen up and get the murder over with. The young women never found Whitwell's hidden money. They stole $1,000 cash and 2 digital cameras and drove back to their home in Brisbane. Burns ultimately pleaded guilty to her role in the crime and was sentenced to at least 13.5 years in prison. Because she's not an Australian citizen, she'll be deported to New Zealand after she finishes serving her term. In 2018, Brittany Dwyer pleaded guilty to felony murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 21 years. The punishment aligned with the wishes of Dwyer's mother, who urged the court to impose the maximum term. Number 2. Edward O'Neill. In 2016, a Houston teenager named Ryan Roberts was found stabbed to death in a wooded area in the southeast part of the city. Investigators charged the victim's best friend, 18-year-old Edward O'Neill, with the young man's murder. O'Neill was a self-proclaimed Satan worshipper with a documented history of mental health issues. Following his arrest, he spent 4 years at the Harris County Jail before the judge reduced his bail to an amount he could come up with. At the time, the case was at a standstill due to questions surrounding O'Neill's competency. He posted bail in 2020 and was released as the case continued to inch its way through the court system. Just a few months later, O'Neill became the prime suspect in the shooting death of his cousin's ex-boyfriend, 39-year-old Derek Mike, who was murdered in a parking lot. According to court records, O'Neill confessed to his mother, who told law enforcement that she was afraid of what else her son might do. She also told investigators that O'Neill had developed a fascination with the devil at an early age and had a history of killing family pets. While O'Neill maintained his innocence in Ryan Roberts' murder, he reportedly claimed that he killed Derek Mike at his cousin's urging after she discovered that Mike had cheated on her. There have been no public updates on the case since 2020, and records show that O'Neill is not currently in state custody. This indicates that the cases may still be on hold due to issues surrounding O'Neill's competency. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. Hannah Hackmeyer. High school senior Sophie Lekiachvili's life was unexpectedly cut short in February of 2024 when the driver of a car she was riding in lost control of the vehicle and crashed into a tree in DeKalb County, Georgia. The car overturned, trapping Lekiachvili and causing the fatal injuries that killed her at the scene. According to a police report, speed played a role in the crash. Police identified the driver as none other than Lekiachvili's best friend, 18-year-old Hannah Hackmeyer. Hackmeyer survived the crash and is now facing charges of first-degree vehicular homicide, driving under the influence for a person under 21, reckless driving, and failure to maintain lane. Attorney Bruce Hagan, who is not involved with the case, told local station WSB-TV that even if Hackmeyer didn't mean to kill the victim, the court could find that she had requisite intent. This is when someone knowingly breaks the law by driving drunk. If convicted as charged, Hackmeyer will face up to 15 years in prison. She was released after posting a $23,000 bond and is required to abide by a strict curfew as she awaits the outcome of the case. Hackmeyer is also banned from driving and was ordered not to drink or use drugs following her release from jail. The outcome of the case remains to be seen. Number 8. Roxana Sikorsky. Lauren and Jeff Sikorsky thought they were giving their 3 adopted children from Poland a better life by bringing them to the United States and raising them in Wayne County, Michigan. They went out of their way to ensure that the kids had a safe and stable upbringing so that they wouldn't worry about the painful realities they'd faced in Poland. But one of the kids, Roxana, struggled with painful memories and other trauma. And like most teens, she didn't open up to her parents about her inner feelings. Instead, she turned to the internet, where she met an older man named Michael Rivera in 2014. There are different versions of what happened next, depending on who you ask. Rivera was facing legal trouble due to the age gap between him and Roxana. Some people believe he manipulated his younger girlfriend into hatching a plot to murder her family, so they couldn't cooperate with the case against him. Others think that the couple worked together to plan a massacre of Roxana's family, and that they were both equally responsible in the scheme. Shortly after 2 a.m. one October morning, Roxana cut her brother's throat. He survived, and the plot to kill the entire household was thwarted when another family member saw what was happening, screamed, and woke everyone up. Roxana Sikorsky and Michael Rivera were charged in connection with the crime, including the parts of the sinister plot that they failed to carry out. Prosecutors made it clear that they planned to hold Roxana accountable to the fullest extent of the law, despite her parents' plea for leniency and mental health treatment as an alternative to prison. As far as the state was concerned, Roxana was capable of making her own decisions and deserved to be treated accordingly under the law. The Sikorskys blamed the bulk of the murderous plan on Rivera, believing that he'd influenced their daughter to agree to something she would have never otherwise even thought about doing. A lot of people agreed with them, while many others sided with the prosecution's heavy-handed approach. The one thing that most people agreed on was the fact that Rivera deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars, and they got their wish in 2015. A jury convicted him on 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder and 1 count each of assault with the intent to murder, using a computer to commit a crime, and assault with a dangerous weapon. Roxana begrudgingly took a plea deal and admitted to 1 count of assault with intent to murder in exchange for having the other 6 counts against her dropped, and as a result, she was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, far shorter than the life sentence she could have faced if she'd been found guilty on all counts. During her sentencing hearing, Roxana stared at the floor as her lawyer spoke to the judge. When it was her turn to talk, she offered a tearful apology to her family. After struggling to get the words out between sobs, she broke down completely. She later withdrew her guilty plea and tried to get a new trial, but ultimately dropped the appeal. And since then, no changes have been made to her conviction or sentence. Do you think it would be fair to extend leniency toward Roxana due to her mental health struggles and young age, or does she deserve to be held accountable as an able-minded adult who was fully aware of the wrongness of their depraved actions? Let us know in the comments below. Number 7. Shondell Jackson. A 21-year-old University of Wisconsin student named Nathan Potter was walking to his Milwaukee apartment early one morning in 2009 when a young man approached and tried to rob him. Potter had no money, so the thief shot him out of anger, and unfortunately, he died from his injuries. Witnesses implicated 2 men in the crime, along with another shooting that happened later that day. 19-year-old Derek J. Thomas and 18-year-old Shondell Jackson. Apparently, Thomas acted as a lookout while Jackson pulled the trigger. Jackson was still at large when police caught up with Thomas. During questioning, he claimed that Jackson had contacted him before the shooting, saying he wanted to commit a robbery because he needed money and had a gun. After shooting Potter and leaving him to die on the sidewalk, the suspects fled to Thomas's home nearby and played video games. Thomas admitted that he and Jackson targeted Potter at random while casing a nearby tavern. The 2 parties didn't know each other, which means that Potter was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. In early 2010, Derek Thomas pleaded guilty to felony murder. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, followed by 8 years of supervised release. A jury then convicted Shondell Jackson of participating in Potter's murder, and as a consequence, he was sentenced to life in prison. He also received a 5-year sentence for the second shooting, which left a man injured. During Jackson's sentencing hearing, his attorney urged the judge to consider his young age and his lack of impulse control. The judge was unswayed, though, and when she announced that Jackson would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the young offender erupted into a tirade. He shouted obscenities at the judge while courtroom deputies struggled to subdue him. While being led out of the courtroom, he smirked at the victim's loved ones and mouthed a nasty word. In the meantime, his supporters taunted Potter's family, and deputies ended up having to pepper spray Jackson to get him under control. Number 6. Nicholas Lindsay. Nicholas Lindsay acquired a serious criminal record at a young age when he was arrested for grand theft in St. Petersburg, Florida in 2010. In February 2011, he fatally shot a police officer during a late-night encounter near Tropicana Field. The incident happened after a resident called 911 and reported seeing a suspicious man in his backyard. Suspecting the man was a burglar, the caller described seeing the suspect standing outside with a brick in his hand before jumping a fence. Officer David Crawford was the first to respond to the call. A second officer then arrived to find him lying on the ground near his patrol vehicle with multiple gunshot wounds. According to reports, Crawford had been shot while reaching for a notepad. Acting on a tip, law enforcement raided Lindsay's home and arrested him the following day. At his mother's urging, he told the truth during questioning and was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. Lindsay's mother, Deneen Sweat, later told local station WFTS that she urged her son to man up and tell what happened. Lindsay's parents were in the interview room with him when he confessed, revealing that he'd thrown the murder weapon in a creek afterward. Much debate followed over whether Lindsay should be tried as an adult, given the nature of the crime. Mayor Bill Foster, who once praised the teen as a troubled youth with the potential to turn his life around, now wanted to see him held accountable the same way anyone over the age of 18 would be. Under Florida's Law Enforcement Protection Act, that meant he'd be looking at an automatic life sentence if convicted. Lindsay was indicted on a first-degree murder charge in early 2011, and he finally went on trial about a year later. His lawyer portrayed him as a scared adolescent and argued that a manslaughter conviction was more appropriate. Prosecutors were quick to point out that all 5 of the shots that were fired struck Crawford, indicating that the shooting was deliberate and therefore qualified as a murder. After being convicted of the murder charge and sentenced to life without parole, Lindsay appealed. It was denied though, and in 2017 his attorneys asked the court to reduce Lindsay's term to 40 years based on new sentencing guidelines for young people. However, the judge once again upheld the life sentence and said that the court would revisit the possibility of reducing it after he serves 25 years. In footage from the court hearing, Lindsay didn't appear to be paying much attention to the proceeding. And when the judge announced that the life sentence would continue, he could be seen grinning, almost as if he wasn't taking the situation seriously. Number 5. Ethan Orton. 5 months before he turned 18, Ethan Orton's mother told him in an email that he had to move out of their Cedar Rapids, Iowa home by his birthday. More specifically, the message stated that once Ethan was a legal adult, his parents were cutting him out of their lives completely. The following day, on October 14, 2021, police responded to reports of a suspicious person at the residence, and officers arrived to find Ethan sitting outside, covered in blood. He quickly confessed to killing his parents, 41-year-old Misty Scott Slade and 42-year-old Casey Arthur Orton, who were found dead inside the house. Both victims had been attacked in their sleep and stabbed repeatedly with a Bowie knife. And after noticing that his mother had survived the initial attack, Ethan finished her off with an axe. When questioned about his motive, he told police that he committed the murders out of a desire to take charge of his life. He later told a psychologist that the email he'd received from his mother pushed him over the edge. Ethan claimed that both his parents had emotionally abused him all of his life and that he'd reached his breaking point. During his trial, a forensic expert testified that Ethan was further agitated because his father had originally taken his side, only to change his mind and side with Ethan's mother. In early 2023, Ethan pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. But under Iowa case law, it would have been unconstitutional to sentence him to life without parole. Judge Ian Thornhill was unmoved by the defense's claims of abuse and a difficult childhood, though, and he felt it was appropriate to issue the harshest sentence possible. During Ethan's sentencing hearing, Thornhill commented on how there's a difference between a teenager disliking their parents' way of running things and being an actual abuse victim. The judge further remarked on the clearly deliberate nature of the killings, including Ethan's decision to follow through with murdering his mother after he realized that she was still breathing. Thornhill imposed 2 concurrent life sentences with the eligibility of parole after 50 years. This means that the earliest Ethan could see freedom again is at the age of 67. It's also very possible that he won't be released, depending on how the parole board feels when the time comes. When he was given an opportunity to speak, Ethan made some remorseful but somewhat puzzling remarks. He thanked his grandmother and sister for forgiving him and noted that they supposedly had proof of the terrible things he accused his parents of putting him through. The teen killer also said the experience made him learn better, whatever that means, and he said that in hindsight, he thinks his parents could have been rehabilitated. He wished he could take back his decision to murder them, but that he'd come to terms with what happened and the fact that it can't be undone. Number 4. Damon Kemp. During the early morning hours of December 7, 2018, police in Daytona Beach, Florida received a call about a break-in at a local apartment complex. Responding officers came face-to-face with a 19-year-old university student from Florida named Damon Kemp, who was accused of trying to force his way into an apartment at gunpoint. Luckily, though, the resident managed to push him out and lock the door. When police arrived, Kemp allegedly walked toward an officer, ignoring the cop's orders to stop. Responding officers noticed that the young man was soaked and he was rambling nonsensically. And at one point, Kemp shouted, "I killed Ace," which was the nickname of his friend, Trey Ingram. Inside an apartment, police found the bullet-riddled bodies of Ingram and Jordan Payden, who were also both 19 years old, and as a result, Kemp was charged with their murders. Prosecutors accused the young man of shooting the victims in the back with a .40 caliber Glock handgun as they desperately tried to run from him. He then washed the blood off himself and disposed of the murder weapon in a nearby pond. Kemp's lawyer argued that the prosecution failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that his client was the killer, and that just because Kemp's handprint was on the gun didn't mean he murdered anyone. And in the event the jurors believed Kemp was the shooter, his attorney claimed that there was enough evidence to conclude that he was legally insane when he committed the crime. There was certainly no doubt that Kemp acted strange in the days leading up to the murder. According to his roommate, he believed that the radio was listening to him and made nonsensical comments, including a remark about National Soil Day. The roommate also claimed that Kemp had put him in a chokehold twice while he was driving. Kemp's strange behavior in court also made it clear that he was mentally unstable. On at least one occasion, he was wheeled into the courtroom in restraints while throwing extremely loud screaming tantrums. And during a bond hearing early on in his case, he repeatedly yelled what sounded like the word God. Then he suddenly went silent and stared blankly toward the front of the room before leaning forward in his wheelchair with a seemingly diabolical look on his face. But being mentally ill didn't mean that Kemp was unaware of the difference between right or wrong. According to prosecutors who failed to provide a motive for the double homicide, the evidence was compelling enough on its own. Not to mention, out of the vast array of strange emotions Kemp displayed in court, remorse didn't seem to be one of them. So he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Under Florida law, Kemp faces up to life in prison, yet there was no news of any strange outbursts during his trial or when his conviction was announced. Perhaps he's come to terms with his fate, although if he has anything to say, he'll most likely get the chance when he's officially sentenced. The definition of insanity is much different from a legal perspective than it is from a clinical standpoint, and it's extremely difficult for murder defendants to obtain an insanity ruling in the United States. Consequently, a lot of profoundly mentally ill defendants end up in the prison system, where access to mental health care is minimal at best. Number 3. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. It's normal for high school students to get upset with their teachers from time to time, especially when they think they deserve a better grade on an assignment. But a young man from Fairfield, Iowa named Willard Miller took his anger to a whole new level in November 2021 after learning that he was failing Spanish. Outraged by the poor mark, Miller followed his teacher, 66-year-old Nohima Graeber, to a park that she frequently visited, and he was accompanied by a classmate named Jeremy Goodale. The young man grabbed Graeber and dragged her into a nearby wooded area where they beat her to death with a baseball bat. Then they hid the victim's body beneath a tarp and stole her van. Graeber's remains were found after her family reported her missing the following day. Classmates were quick to point investigators in the direction of Miller and Goodale, and of course the teens were quick to point the finger at one another as the primary actor in the gruesome crime. Miller initially denied hitting Graeber at all with the bat, while Goodale accused his friend of being the mastermind of the disturbing plot. Prosecutors, on the other hand, claimed that both suspects participated in the fatal beating and that they planned the crime up to 2 weeks in advance. Graeber's family was left broken by her death, which occurred just days before her 67th birthday. Her husband died from cancer days before Miller's sentencing hearing, and Graeber's family believes that the heartbreak and stress over the murder is what caused his health to spiral. Instead of moving forward with plans to testify against one another, both young men ultimately decided to take a plea deal in order to avoid a trial. In the end, they each admitted to 1 count of first-degree murder. Miller was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 35 years, while Goodale faces a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. During his sentencing hearing, Miller apologized to Graeber's family. He admitted that he knew what he planned to do was wrong and that he followed through with it anyway. As the gravity of his actions and the reality of his future behind bars sank in, he grew slightly tearful but remained mostly unemotional. The judge was unmoved by Miller's words, so while handing down the sentence, he described the teen as sinister, evil, and brutal. He acknowledged that Miller's young mind wasn't fully developed when the crime occurred, but saw it as no excuse for doing something that was off the charts in terms of the cruelty and violence involved. Miller appealed his sentence shortly after the hearing, and Goodale is scheduled to be sentenced in August 2023. Number 2. Dante Wright. A family's worst nightmare came true on October 4, 2016, when 18-year-old Jordan Klee was found dead from a single gunshot wound in the yard of his Ann Arbor, Michigan home. He'd been killed in a botched robbery attempt by 3 teenagers. 17-year-old Dante Wright was accused of pulling the trigger. His co-conspirators Delrino Gracie and Jamarius Ellison were also charged in connection with the case. By the time Wright's trial rolled around, Gracie and Ellison had already taken plea deals. During pre-trial hearing, he unexpectedly confessed to robbing and killing Klee, hoping to also hop on the plea bargain bandwagon. Prosecutors were on board with the idea, which came with a 25 to 52-year sentence. But the judge almost revoked the deal when Wright grinned during the victim impact statements that Klee's loved ones read in court. As they mustered the strength to face Wright and poured their hearts out, he made a mockery of their pain and suffering. The judge was infuriated by the display and threatened to take the plea agreement off the table and take the case to trial. He then left the decision up to Klee's family, who decided that they wanted to move forward with the plea deal so that they could continue healing from the senseless tragedy. For their own mental and emotional well-being, they forgave Wright despite his despicable behavior. Wright's attorney apologized to the court on his client's behalf, claiming that the young man smiles when he gets nervous. His mother, Antoinette Carter, told MLive.com that she believed her son smiled due to mental health problems. She said that he dealt with everything in life by smiling. But even if that was true, it's understandable that people were bothered by what they saw. At his sentencing hearing, Wright said that he loved his family and that he'd see them soon. He could have personally apologized for the smiling incident, but he chose not to. And while Wright may not languish behind bars until his dying days, he might as well get comfortable because he's going to be in prison until 2042 at the very earliest, while his maximum release date is in 2078. He'll be somewhere between 43 and 70 years old when he sees freedom again. Number 1. Peyton Gendron. On May 14, 2022, a 19-year-old white supremacist named Peyton Gendron drove 200 miles from his home in Conklin, New York, to the city of Buffalo. Armed with an AR-15 style rifle and with a GoPro camera rolling, he walked toward the entrance of a top supermarket in a predominantly African-American neighborhood and opened fire on innocent people who were just going about their day. The carnage began in the parking lot and continued as the deranged mass murderer walked through the store. 10 people were killed and 3 others were injured by the gunshots, leaving Western New Yorkers devastated, terrified, and infuriated by the unprovoked violence. Responding officers convinced Gendron to drop his gun and surrender, but it would later be revealed that he planned to continue killing people if he managed to escape from the first crime scene. He'd planned the massacre months in advance, and while the signs were easy to notice in hindsight, his concerning behavior was overlooked in the years leading up to the shooting, and any opportunities to intervene were missed. Gendron made no efforts to hide his motive for the mass killing. In fact, he droned on about his reasons in a disturbing 180-page manifesto that he released shortly before he committed the horrific act. Further investigation revealed that he spent a vast majority of his time on the internet connecting with people who shared similar hateful beliefs. Both state and federal authorities charged Gendron with dozens of crimes. Then, 5 months after the shooting, he pleaded guilty to 15 state-level charges, including 10 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder motivated by hate, and domestic terrorism motivated by hate. As a result, he received 10 consecutive life sentences in state prison. Gendron listened quietly and looked down at the floor for much of his sentencing hearing, appearing emotionless at some moments and shamefully aware of his unforgivable behavior during others. And while there's no doubt that he's a cold-blooded, heartless killer, even he couldn't hold back tears during some of the most heart-wrenching moments of the victim impact statements. When it was his turn to speak, he apologized to his victims and renounced his extremist beliefs. And while the emotion appeared genuine on some level, many people understandably find it hard to believe that someone who could commit such an unspeakable act of violence in the first place could ever come to truly regret it. More than once throughout the hearing, family members of Gendron's victims struggled to hold back their anger. They should have never had to face the reality of having their loved ones cruelly ripped from them at the hands of a complete stranger who hated his victims for no reason other than the color of their skin. Gendron's federal case is ongoing. He faces 26 hate crime charges and additional gun-related counts, and he could face the death penalty if convicted. But he's definitely going to remain locked up until his dying day, and will thankfully never get to enjoy even a single moment of freedom again. Thanks for watching. Would you rather enjoy your freedom now, knowing that you would spend the last 3 years of your life in prison, or serve a 10-year sentence now and spend the rest of your life living in the free world? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe to the channel.